So last Monday, Magic the Gathering made a brand new ban list announcement, and this one hit standard. Like, it hit standard a lot. There were 7 cards banned in standard, and only a month before rotation. I don't think the consequences of this announcement are going to see anything really get solved in that time period. There's a few spoilers for the next set that are going to factor into what I have to say here, but I want to go into how almost the whole standard format has been pretty well upended by these bans, and what the format, especially the decks that got hit, looked like forward after it, and maybe even a little bit talk about the rotation itself too. Let's start with the deck that won Pro Tour Final Fantasy, shall we? That would be Mono Red, which made up 50% of the top 8 and has some crazy win percentages going on. The big bans out of this deck are Monstrous Rage and Heartfire Hero, which helped the deck have both speed and sustainability to put massive amounts of pressure as quickly as turn 2, and the sustain where going past turn 3 wasn't really going to be too big of a deal. We'll talk more about Monstrous Rage later, but let's focus on Heartfire Hero, which is a linchpin of the real engine that lets the deck start getting off giant damage swings so quickly. Mono Red is pretty much always going to be something that exists in standard, even if it's not as powerful as the mouse engine made it, or it splashes a second color while still calling itself Mono Red for some reason. And truthfully, what I think is most likely to happen is that we get a Lizard engine of pressure instead. Mono Red is already running Hired Claw and Magebane Lizard, one of which is good early aggression that can scale up through the game, and the other is a good counter to the Prowess and Prowess adjacent strategies, although admittedly we may be seeing a few less of those based on the results that have come out since the banning so far, but most of those are lower level, so you can't really use those as an indication of the whole metagame per se. You'd need a third Lizard to really call it an engine, and there are a couple of them. If you really want to counter the Flurry adjacent decks, you've got Hearthborn Battler, but to be honest, that feels more like a side deck pick to me. Valley Flamecaller, on the other hand, is perfect for a more top-end aggro package role, as not only is it making the Lizard package better, it's also letting you keep around what remains of the mouse package. I don't think Hired Claw Mono Red is going to be as explosive as Heartfire Mono Red, but considering how much is there to work with for sustained aggression and even more of a potential anti-prowess and anti-flurry strategy. Oh, and if you think rotation's hitting this deck, no, the only thing that's missing is a piece of removal out of the sideboard. It'll be fine when Edge of Eternities comes out. The other 50% of the top 8, and I'm not even kidding about that, is also the other top deck that happens to be running Monstrous Rage, and that's Izzet Prowess. Not only did it have Rage banned out of it, but also Quarry Steel Cutter, a flurry piece that Wizards borderline called a mistake being printed in Standard in the first place. Now, it's probably a little bit less surprising to see half the top 8 players playing this deck when about half of the entire player pool for the tournament were on the deck, but considering this is the Pro Tour we're talking about, the fact that one deck was about half of the Pro Tour at all should be considered a problem in and of itself. But I digress. In theory, with the most busted pieces out of this deck, it'll probably go away, right? Well, not necessarily. There's about one extra card compared to Mono Reds that's going to be rotating out of this deck, and some of the ways to replace the card are already in smaller numbers in the deck as is. These decks are already using a mostly 5-card split of Monstrous Rage and Wild Ride, a 1-mana pump spell of pretty similar value proposition, and there are plenty of replacements to keep a mix alongside Wild Ride, be it Turn Inside Out to double as a means of minimize losses on removal, or something like Shore Up or Dive Down for more defensive pump spell options. And this is important because of Final Fantasy's biggest new tool in the deck that isn't going anywhere. Vivi Ornithir, who basically just makes the Izzet Prowess deck practically by itself. It's possible the deck won't be straight up just the best anymore, but I do think it's still going to be in a very dominant position as long as red pump spells exist at all alongside Vivi. Okay, we got the big decks that really deserve the bans out of the way. Now we can move on to a deck that honestly just kind of got rotated a month early in the form of Azorius Omniscience. This is basically a combo deck that puts the card Omniscience, which makes everything out of your hand free, and then brings it back with Abuelo's Awakening, which is a card that was about to rotate out anyway. Now, technically, you could say the deck isn't completely dead, since you can still do the Omniscience plan with Builder's Talent a little bit slower, and with Yuna, Hope of Spira, but there's plenty of significant drop in speed, even if it only looks like a single turn, and there's plenty of other things that are part of negating the downsides of the strategy, like Scroll Shift, that are also rotating out. It's possible I'm going to be wrong about this, and people will in fact just shift to Bant Omniscience instead of just Azorius, but I'm not holding my breath that this deck was ever going to be very long for Standard once August came around anyway. Let's talk for a second about the video that I made after Pro Tour Aether Drift. I mentioned how Domain Overlords was going to continue being super dominant, and well, that's because I was anticipating more slow cards to come out in the Dragonstorm set, and I certainly wasn't expecting Vivi at the time. Maybe the character, but not how powerful the card is. You get the idea. Domain Overlords has maintained some metagame presence, and I think part of that is because of Up the Beanstalk, which has proven itself to be fuel for all kinds of high color count decks since it was printed and thrown into pre-Overlord domain decks that were just valuing you out with Atraxa. If not for this ban, I could have seen the deck actually continuing to be viable in a post-Leyline Binding world, but with both Up the Beanstalk gone, now to reduce card advantage, and Binding about to be gone to strip away an efficient piece of later game removal, it's low enough down by now that this is enough to kill the deck in my eyes. I don't think most of the cards go away. Maybe we see Zur and Yuna get used in a 4-color Omniscience strategy. Some of these Overlords still have places in a few different decks, and I think Ride's End is going to be one of the newer pieces of hotness when it comes to white removal. But I think this deck doesn't so much evolve from here as, kind of just go away. Either that or merge with Azorius Omni. Alright, the last pre-existing deck that I want to talk about is the one that, in my opinion, is in the lowest position now, but was way bigger during the Pro Tour Aether Drift cycle, but still had some fight in it, and that would be Pixie, named for the card Nurturing Pixie, which you could use to return other cards with entered battlefield effects to the hand to get those ETBs again. The most efficient and best use of this was Hopeless Nightmare, which served as damage and hand control, something you don't normally get out of only one card at this kind of efficiency. Part of the reason this deck has remained around is because of how easily it's been able to shift to what's in it in changing standard environments. The current version is Orzhov, but the previous Esper version used blue in part for This Town Ain't Big Enough, a powerful piece of tempo play that added more methods of self-balance for stuff like Nightmare, which has now also been banned alongside Hopeless Nightmare. Truthfully, I'm not so sure that this outright kills the deck. The discard strategy of Pixie is likely chiefly there because of how efficiently Hopeless Nightmare enables it, so it could probably just as easily shift into something else to lock games instead. Call it cope for a strategy that I personally do like if you want, you're probably not wrong, but although I think the next version of Pixie looks very different from what we're seeing now, I'm not exactly convinced that it's out of the conversation when you balance out how its bad matchups have been hurt with how it has been hurt. But now we have traveled all the way down well, not all the way down, but most of the way down the metagame to talk about what's different. Let me talk about what I see as the top going forward. There are 4 decks in particular I'm seeing in Standard's future as real top contenders. One of which is going to be some kind of Yuna Enchantress build, which may be what Domain Overlords evolves into, fuses with Azorius Omni into, whatever you want to say. A lot of the powerful cards in Domain are going to want a new home, and Yuna provides quite a lot to giving that new home. I'd anticipate some elements of Domain, but with fewer high-cost spells since there's no longer a synergy for using them. Throw in the possibility of elements from either Omniscience or Pixie, depending on the taste and what seems to work better. I think this is finally the point where the Domain part of the name for this goes away, and we just call it Yuna Overlords. Or, if you really want to, Zur Overlords, if you're really that against naming a deck after Final Fantasy. Next, 2 decks I see in the future come in pairs, and they're decks that got hit the hardest. I think Is It Prowess and Mono Red Aggro are going to be still near the top, although not quite as dominant. I think Is It Prowess is probably going to get the strongest position of the 2 here, and there's a couple of reasons. Mainly, that Izzet Prowess's core doesn't really change all that much, as Corey's Steel Color would make it seem. The most powerful card in Izzet was unfazed, while Mono Red was built upon the Mouse engine, and having a third of that engine go down is a blow that people have to adjust to, even if I can see where that adjustment happens fairly quickly. But there is another reason I think Mono Red falls into a weaker position. Well, that's because I actually don't think Mono Red will maintain its status as the preeminent aggro deck after rotation. Don't get me wrong, the main aggro deck is still going to be red. That's almost always going to be the case. But now it'll also be green, because I think that red-green landfall is going to be, if not overtaking Mono Red as the top aggro deck, at the very least challenging its spot. We've already got a lot of landfall synergies in Final Fantasy, primarily coming from the set's chocobos, especially cards like Zat's Chocobo, and all the extra land tutoring throughout the set. We can also tell that landfall is likely to be a theme tied to red-green in some way in Edge of Eternities, based on the spoiler uncommon Tanook and Memorial Instant. I apologize if I butchered that name, which deals damage on landfall and draws cards if you trigger it multiple times. These are normally signposts for draft archetypes, which normally means you'll be getting a lot of cards to support it. And while there will be a lot of those that aren't played and constructed, you know, there's probably going to be at least some that are playable. Overlord of the Hauntwoods also supports this deck already. You're ramping, so you might not even need to impend it, which means it'll be more likely to attack. And if it does that, you're making way more lands, and when your lands trigger the rest of your board, that becomes a lot more value that you're putting down. That's why I think red-green landfall is going to be the #1 aggro deck. But what do you think? Did your favorite deck get hit? Are you happy to finally see Up the Beanstalk gone? Let me know how wrong my predictions for future Standard are in the comments, and be sure to leave a like on your way out. But until next time, this is the Boonslayer signing out.